Good morning, Boker Tov, and welcome to today's Torah study. Today is July 1st. It's a Thursday, and we're learning about the laws of meat and milk. Kosher laws, kosher crash course. It's very, very important to know not only the philosophy of Judaism, but also the practice of Judaism. It's not enough to love your loved ones. It's important to actually express that love. And when we nurture a relationship, a real relationship with the master of the universe, with our Father in heaven, our lover in heaven, the way to do that is not only through learning Tanya and learning about the inspiring sermons, it's also about down to earth, ground zero action. And that is why we learn the laws of kosher. That's on Thursdays. That's why we learn halacha. It's very, very important to always know how we are supposed to serve Hashem. And that is all part of the 613 commandments of the Torah, one of which, a very important part of which, is the laws of kosher. Doing in this crash course. Now, in this crash course, you can find it all. Hopefully, it's going to be sequenced soon by Winston from Indonesia. It's going to be sequenced soon on our YouTube page in order. But generally, all classes you can find at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens, where you can find all previous classes to review. And today, we're going to be continuing in our next section, which is the section about the laws of meat and milk, the separation of meat and milk, which is probably half of the laws of kosher. Half is the laws of kosher. The other half is the laws of meat and milk, which is all collectively make up the laws of kashrus, of kosher. Today we're going to be talking about general rules in the laws of kosher, and it's dedicated, today's Torah study, the entire month, is dedicated by Daniel Geiker, in gratitude to Hashem for the wonderful blessings that Hashem is and will continue and has bestowed upon Michael ben Miriam. He should continue to have good health, excellent health, for many years of health and happiness together with all of his family members. I'd like to welcome Marty from New York, and Terry from Atlanta, Corey from Palm Beach Gardens, and Howard and Susan from Boynton Beach. YouTube looking very, very quiet again. I wonder if there's issues on YouTube or not. Elaine is on it. Okay, good. I see you, Elaine. You are on it from Ibis, and that means we are live. Okay, good. So let's keep on moving here. We are learning the laws of the principles of kosher of meat and milk. So what is the essence of the prohibition of the mixture of meat and milk? And welcome to you, Rob, our chairman of our daily minyan from exile in Chicago. Good morning, Rob. Welcome. Good to have you with us. Voluntary exile. Also known as snowbird ship. Okay, good. So the prohibition of meat and milk, which the Torah prohibits, is not only on the mixing of pieces of meat and pieces of milk, of cheese, but also on the mixing of the flavor of each one, flavor of meat, with the mixing of the flavor of milk. What does that mean? So even if you don't actually have a piece of cheese and a piece of milk, but you have a pot which was used for meat within the past 24 hours, then it has the fresh flavor of meat. 24 hours is the cutoff. After 24 hours, it's considered like it's no longer really there. Interesting concept. Without us getting into the scientific component of that, what happens after 24 hours to flavor that's embedded within a pot or a vessel or a dish? I'm grateful that it's after 24 hours, because if it went on forever, we'd have much more complications. In any event, good morning, Andy from St. Louis, right? Missouri, I think, right? No, Louisville. Sorry, I always make that mistake. Louisville, Kentucky. Good to have you. Okay, good. Top fan, it says. What does that mean, Andy? It says top fan on Facebook. Does that mean a top fan of this class or a top fan of Facebook? Or what does that mean? Anyways, so where are we going now? We're talking about the flavor which is embedded. And this is a major component that people don't really understand about the laws of meat and milk. They say, well, I'm not mixing meat and milk. I'm not eating a cheeseburger, so it's fine. But if you go to a non-kosher restaurant, you've got a problem in the sense that if they're serving you, let's say, dairy food that was made in a dish that just made meat, even if it was clean, the meat of the previous dish is now inside. The flavor of the meat is now inside of the omelet, the dairy omelet that you're eating now. And that's the problem. Therefore, when meat got milk mixed with milk and it leaves a flavor inside of the milk, it's got a flavor of meat. You're not allowed to eat that in this way, the dairy, the cheese. Even if you remove the actual piece of meat from there, but if there's leftover flavor, it's exactly a problem. Now, how much flavor of one and the other is a problem? So for this we say, how much does it mean? Depends on how the mixture was, how the shidduch was made, how the meeting was made. If they were mixed together when they were cold, there is really no transfer of flavor from the one to the other, except for this point of contact. Right? In that case, you just slice off the edge and you'd be fine. However, when they touched together, when they were hot, then the flavor is, there's a word here in English which I don't know. It's sort of like maybe permeates. The flavor permeates through the heat. It permeates through each other entirely. And there you got a problem. And that's when you come into the issue of 1 in 60. If the flavor is 1 in 60, in the let's say you got a drop of milk, a drop of cheese, let's say a piece of cheese, small tiny piece of cheese, fell onto a giant roast, and it was hot. So now the flavor of the cheese goes into the meat, and the meat goes into the cheese. Now, there's obviously a lot more meat here than cheese. So the entire piece of cheese is treif. You throw it at the piece of cheese. But now, that little bit of cheese, there's no more than the size of that olive, however big it is, that went into the roast. So if you look at the roast, you say there's 60 times, there's 100 times of that cheese in this roast. You say there can't be more than one. There's no more than 1 in 60 in this roast. There's actually less flavor. It's probably 1 in 100. That cheese is nullified because it's like 1 in 100 inside of this roast, and therefore it is not a problem. Next rule. We're going to learn now today 8 rules of the principles of meat and milk. So the second rule is how to nullify the taste of the meat or the taste of the milk, which is an idea we just spoke about. So a drop of milk that fell onto the piece of meat, right? So the sages concluded that when there is more than 60 times of the smaller substance in the bigger substance, and let's say the cheese into the meat, then that gets nullified, as I just explained, because it cancels out the taste of the milk. Therefore, you're allowed to eat the meat. So again, the little piece of cheese falls onto the big roast, and it's hot, so it all gets spread everywhere. With that size meat going into that size tiny cheese, it's 100% treif. You throw out the cheese. But there cannot be more than the volume of that original cheese inside of the whole roast right now. So therefore, it's completely nullified. You don't have to do anything to the roast, and you can eat the roast with the flavor of the cheese inside of it, because it's nullified less than 1 in 100. What's the idea of 1 in 60, by the way? Why do we say that less than 1 in 60 is treif, more than 1 in 60 is cancelled? Because the human palate cannot taste more than 1/60th. Sorry, less than 1/60th. If you had one part in 60, you would be able to taste the taste. Or let's say 1 in 59, you would be able to taste. But 1 in 60 and up, you wouldn't be able to taste the taste anymore. Imagine, just to give an example, if you poured a little bit of Coca-Cola into a swimming pool, and then you and you mixed it up nicely, and then you drank a little bit of water from that swimming pool. You would not taste the Coca-Cola if it's more than 1 in 60. That's the idea here. So too, in the other way around, when a piece of meat falls into a pot of milk, falls inside the pot of milk, you get a milk soup, and the piece of meat falls inside. If you have in the milk soup more than 60 times of the meat, then the taste of the meat is 100% canceled out. You're allowed to drink the milk, drink the soup, but you do have to remove the flesh. You do have to remove the meat from the pot and to throw it out, because that piece of meat is filled with milk much more. It's like completely filled up with milk. It's got milk and meat inside fully. And obviously you can't say that there's 60 times of meat to cancel out all the milk, because there's much more milk than there is meat. Now, I just want to explain that this is the idea of mixing in a milchik spoon into a fleishik soup. So when you have a milchik soup, whatever, let's say you have a chicken soup, right? And you use a dairy spoon. You put a dairy spoon by mistake, a ladle, let's say, to mix it up, right? So now you have to ask yourself a few very important questions. First of all, was the spoon, the dairy spoon that was put into the meat soup? You're obviously not allowed to do it, but let's say you did. It's called b'diavad, ex post facto. You did it. So now do I have to chuck out the chicken soup? I've got guests coming in half an hour, right? There's no time to make another chicken soup. What do I do? Do I throw out the chicken soup or not? Well, you say like this: was this dairy ladle really dairy? Was it used in the past 24 hours for dairy or not? If it wasn't, then you have already a lot more flexibility here. But if it was used in the past 24 hours and now it's filled with the fresh flavor of dairy, now you have to ask yourself, okay, so how much soup is there? Is there more than 60 times of the entire volume of the ladle? We look at the ladle as if it's a piece of cheese. And if there is more than 60 times, then it's fine. You can serve the soup, not a problem. Obviously, only ex post facto. Third principle of the mixing of meat and milk is mixing the flavor of meat and the flavor of milk into a pot. So the prohibition of mixing the meat and the milk is not only with the actual meat and the actual milk, but it also applies with their flavors, which is felt, their flavors that are fresh, that cannot be seen in the eye. A flavor that's tasted but not seen. That is also as prohibited as the meat and the milk themselves. And therefore, a pot that was used to cook meat now has the flavor of the meat inside of the pot. And if you use that pot to cook milk, then the flavor of the meat, which is inside of the pot, the invisible flavor of the meat that's inside of that pot, will come out and be cooked fully into the dairy dish inside of that pot. Similarly, the flavor of the cheese inside of the pot will go into the walls, into the fleishik, the meat walls of the pot. Turns out that by cooking dairy in a meat pot, you are violating the prohibition of cooking meat and milk together. Even though there's no meat to be found, it's only invisible. It's in the walls of the dish. Fourth principle, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead. Mickey, this is Cookie. Boker Tov, good morning. Cookie has it on her husband's name. No problem. That's fine. Good. Any questions, comments, please let me know, and let's continue going. Fourth principle of meat and milk. What about the kind of flavor that's hidden, invisible in the walls of the pot? There's good flavor, and then there is blemished flavor. That's the law of the 24 hours. Let's talk about this. So a pot that was used to cook meat, and the flavor of the meat is now cooked into the walls, is invisible in those walls only for a period of 24 hours since the time it was used to cook. After 24 hours have passed, it's now considered that flavor, that invisible flavor of meat in the walls of the pot, is now blemished. And it's considered much downgraded, which means you're still not allowed to use that pot to cook dairy, even a week later, because it's a fleishik pot. But ex post facto, if you already did, then you have much more flexibility, much more leniency because the flavor is blemished. What about a regular dish that you just don't know? You just don't know if this dish was used in the past 24 hours or not. Then you can err on the side of benefit to say that probably it was not used in the past 24 hours. And therefore, you can assume that the flavor was a parav or not a problematic flavor in the pot. When would that happen? Again, if you use the dish in the kitchen, somebody put the wrong spoon into the into the soup, and you look at the spoon, you're like, does anybody know if the spoon is used in the past 24 hours? And like, we don't do GPS tracking on our spoons. We don't know if this spoon was used in the past 24 hours for dairy. So you could just err on the side of benefit to say, well, we just assume that it wasn't. Corey, plant-based meat that have the flavor of real meat is still okay if cooked in a dairy pot accidentally. Correct. Plant-based meat, Corey, let's assume that it is plant-based meat, which means that it's made out of plants. Then it's not meat. It might look like meat, it might smell like meat, it might taste like meat, but it's not meat. Like the bacon that they serve today, the fake bacon, some sort of pastrami, they call it bacon, but it's not bacon, it's pastrami, right? So if it's plant-based, indeed, then it would be parav. It's not meat. Now, the question is about lab-grown beef, is that not all lab-grown beef is made out of plants. Some of it is made out of stem cells of actual animals that they've used in the lab to grow meat. So it's actually meat that comes from an animal, from one tiny, tiny, tiny cell of an animal. And that's where you have huge, huge, huge issues. Actually, I had a meeting here a week or two ago with the head of Machon Lev College in Jerusalem. It is a college that is dedicated to Torah study and secular scientific research. And one of their big projects is working on lab-grown beef. We were talking about this. Anyways, so what happens now when you cook dairy in this pot which has flavor of meat that is more than 24 hours old. It is not a biblical prohibition of cooking meat and milk, but it is a rabbinical prohibition because the sages prohibited us from playing these games in order that we shouldn't come to making any mistakes within 24 hours. Therefore, even though it's prohibited rabbinically to use a meat pot to cook dairy after 24 hours from the previous use, nevertheless, if you did make a mistake and you did already do this ex post facto, as we say in Hebrew, bidi eved, that's a great word to introduce into your lexicon, bidi eved, B-D-I-E-V-E-D, bidi eved. It's actually Aramaic. If you already did it, right? Then in such a case, even though you did violate a rabbinical prohibition, again, you didn't violate a biblical prohibition because the taste is over 24 hours old. Biblically, only actual meat and milk and only actual fresh flavor of meat and milk, which is swallowed in the pot within 24 hours, is prohibited. But this is more than 24 hours old, and therefore it's rabbinically prohibited. So if you already did it, though you've technically violated a rabbinical prohibition, are you allowed to use it? Our sages still did not extend the prohibition to prevent you from using it ex post facto if you cooked the dairy in a pot of meat that was more than 24 hours old. There is an exception, however, which is something which is sharp. If there's a sharp food in there, like an onion or a garlic or a radish or something which is piquant, sharp, spicy, then what that does is by cooking, let's say you're cooking an onion soup in that meat pot that was more than 24 hours old, then the flavor of the onions, of the sharp food, will actually refresh and renew the flavor that's embedded in those pots, in that meat pot, and it makes it actually fresh, and that becomes all over again biblically prohibited. So you're allowed to eat the food, but the walls of the pot need to be koshered, which means within 24 hours is a biblical prohibition. After 24 hours is a rabbinical prohibition. If you already did it, after 24 hours, you can eat the food, but the pot needs to be koshered. Fifth of 8 principles we're covering today, and that is what we just mentioned, a sharp, spicy food, which renews and refreshes the dormant taste within the walls of a pot that was over 24 hours old. So a food that was, a spicy food that was cooked or soaked 18 minutes. What does it mean soaked? Let's say you had it just sat there for 18 minutes. Either was cooked with heat for like 2 seconds, or if it was soaking in this pot for 18 minutes with a spicy food inside of it, then it transforms the flavor within the pot, which was dormant, was more than 24 hours old. It was only rabbinically prohibited. It renews it, and it makes it again a fresh taste. Therefore, a pot that was used that was more than 24 hours old since its last fleishik use, and now you're using it for a dairy food which has spiciness in it, then the food right now renews the flavor in the pot. It becomes fresh meat flavor coming out of the pot. And so too with a knife. The same principle applies to a knife. A knife that was used to cut hot meat more than 24 hours ago, and now you're using it to cut an onion. So the onion or the garlic or the radish or something else that's spicy will renew the flavor of the meat that was more than 24 hours old in the knife. And it will have the exact same principle. The knife becomes a fleishik knife, 100%. Turns out that a spicy food which was cut with a knife that was dairy, right? Let's say you had a dairy knife. You haven't used it in a week. You're cutting now an onion. So what happens? The onion renews the flavor of the milchik inside the knife. The knife becomes a milchik knife again, fresh. And what happens to the onion? The onion becomes milchik. If you cook that onion, which was used with a week-old dairy knife, the onion became milchik. You put it into a meat soup, and now you're dealing with a soup which has an onion size full of dairy inside of it. And that goes back to a previous principle that we learned, which is a biblical prohibition of cooking meat and milk together, assuming that there's less than 1/60th in the soup to the less than 60 times the soup to the fleishik soup to the size of this onion, and therefore you got a big problem. You got to be very, very, very careful with onions and garlic and spicy foods in the kitchen. It's almost best to have a separate knife to cut dairy, a pair of knife, like an onion knife for onions and spicy foods, because that way there's never transfer of flavor because the onions will always be parav, and you won't have to worry about them. You can take an onion that was cut with a parav knife, a neutral knife, to put it into the dairy soup or the meat soup because it's not a problem. Ed Hockman, I have a question. Where do new plant-based foods fit in? I'm not sure where you wondering where they fit in. I mean, if you order them, you have them. If they're available on Amazon, I don't know. But if you get a hold of plant-based meats, or plant-based foods, then I'm assuming that they will have the status of plant-based. They'll be status of dairy of parav, and not meat or milk. That's kind of where they fit into this conversation because somebody asked a question earlier. Okay, 3 more principles today. Number 6 is the law of the knife when it comes to meat and milk. Flavor coming out of a knife. Now, this is without even talking about spicy foods, just the knife itself. When you use a knife to cut a hot food, then the knife will, like heat and like spicy foods, the knife will actually transfer taste because of the pressure of the knife itself. The knife flavor will go into the food because of the pressure of the knife. But if you use the knife to cut something within 24 hours, then the flavor of the knife is fresh. But if you've not used this knife for 24 hours, then the flavor emitted by the knife is not a fresh flavor. In other words, in the same way that flavor is transferred through heat, flavor is transferred through the pressure of the knife. That's just the principle. In any event, if the knife was not cleaned properly and it has like leftover residue from whatever it cut earlier, then certainly whatever oil was on that knife now goes cooked into the food that you're cutting right now. So where there's no heat, there is something called the transfer of flavor through heat, or through spicy foods, or through the pressure of the knife. When you cut something which is spicy, as we just spoken about, now you got the pressure of the knife and the spiciness. Then what happens is the pressure of the knife transfers the flavor, but the spiciness renews the aged flavor in the knife to make it fresh flavor, which is being disseminated throughout all the food. So even if it's more than 24 hours old, as we just said, it's considered like the whole food has been cooked. Whatever you cut a piece of bread with a fleshig knife. Let's say you have onion bread, right? You got onion bread. You're cutting onion bread with a fleshig knife that was used a week ago, last time. The onion will renew the flavor of the knife to make it fully fleshig. The pressure of the knife will spread will spread the meat throughout the whole bread, and the whole bread becomes fleshig now. Okay, number 7. What are other methods of transfer of flavor from throughout the meat and milk? In order for a dish to be considered fleshig or milchik, in order for flavor to be transferred in and out of a pot, and in order to come into the pot or out of the pot, you have a few options. One is heat, cooking the meat or cooking the milk. So heat will transfer the flavor in and out of the pot. Another manner is soaking for 24 hours. If you soak a liquid inside a pot for 24 hours, even if it's completely cold, you just put water in a pot and it sits there for 24 hours cold. After 24 hours, the flavor has gone from the water into the pot, from the pot into the water, even if there's no heat. When it soaks with something which is spicy, like let's say you put an alcohol inside of a glass, for example, and it sits there for 18 minutes, not 24 hours. If it's spicy, it's 18 minutes like alcohol. Then what happens is, like the vodka, let's say you're doing a penne alla vodka, let's say, right? You make a vodka sauce, right? So that sauce sitting in the pot after 18 minutes, bam, the flavor is transferred. And then the third way, or the fourth way really, is the pressure of the knife. When you cut the knife, even when there's no heat, there's no soaking 24 hours, there's no soaking 18 minutes with spiciness, but just the pressure of the knife alone is also considered that the knife will disseminate its flavor throughout the entire dish that's been cut. Final law that we're going to learn today, the final principle of kosher, is like this: how other manners of removing the prohibition from the piece. It's like this. When you have a mixture, when meat and milk touch together, there are 5 different options that show us how the extent to which the flavor has gone through into the other. And based on this, you have 5 different manners in which to remove the prohibition. So the first of them is washing. One manner is if you just wash off, in order to make it kosher again. So one manner would be if you just wash the piece of meat and wash the piece of milk, it's fine, right? And that would be, for example, if the meat and the milk touched cold. They just touched. A little piece of cheese touched a little piece of meat cold. They just touched. That's it. So there wasn't a heat, there wasn't a knife, there wasn't spiciness, nothing. They just touched. You wash them off and that's fine. So that's one of 5 ways in order to make things kosher again. A second way, depending on the extent of the contact, is to scratch off, removing a thin layer, like to scrape off a thin layer with a knife or some sort of a peeler. So if there was slightly more contact in the meat and the milk, as we'll learn throughout the laws of meat and milk, then what you have to do to make it kosher, just slice off a layer. A third degree of koshering it is to actually remove not just a thin layer, but a more thicker layer at the point of contact. It's what's called the separating a klipa, separating like a layer. It's called separating a layer, not just a point of contact, but it's actually slicing off a full layer. Then there's a fourth manner of koshering. Obviously, it's all got to do with the degree of contact, which we'll learn about later. And that is removing what's called a kadei natila. It's about 2 centimeters thickness at the point of contact. For example, the difference here would be the fattiness of the foods. So if it's a lean piece of meat with a lean piece of cheese, it doesn't spread as much as if it was a fatty piece of meat with a fatty piece of milk, right? So that's the difference here about how the degree to the spreading. And finally, the 5th way is by canceling it out 60 times over. If it's more than 60 times, we've learned about this many times. If it's more than 60 times over, then it's okay, then it's kosher. And if it doesn't, if it's less than 60 times, then it's treif. Okay, and now just to point out, it makes no difference if the meat is coming in contact with the milk or the milk is coming in contact with the meat. They're absolutely the same as how they impact each other, right? So that's a principle we'll keep in mind as we proceed through this process. And that today, folks, sums up the conclusion of the basic principles of the laws of meat and milk. We'll be going through this in much more detail, more granular detail as we race our way through the laws of meat and milk. And hopefully we'll be able to get them all nicely clarified over the next few months. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining me here today. Have a wonderful day today. A special Misha Beirach to Michael Ben Miriam for a complete and speedy recovery in all of his body parts, limbs, veins, and sinews. May he go to complete health. Thank you, Daniel Geico, for dedicating this month of Torah study. We are so grateful. And may the merit of today's Torah study and this whole month's Torah study serve to bring all the blessing of health and healing and success and prosperity to you and all of your family members. Thank you so much, everybody. Shalom, and have a wonderful day.